Hello, Kentucky Realtors family and friends, and welcome to today's Realtor Town Hall. At a time when our nation is being rocked by a global pandemic, racial injustice, and seemingly one of the greatest political divides in many of our lifetimes, a time when we're challenged to work virtually in every way possible as it relates to our business, social media is a normal way of life to express everything from announcing birth, dinners, death, again, nearly everything that some of us do. Many ideas are positive and encouraging. Unfortunately, others post including personal and group attacks on others that differ in their views, particularly to different religious, cultural, sexual, and racial differences, to name a few. In some cases, those attacks become so personal across the line that they actually make you cringe when you read them. Realtors, how and when in the world of C2EX, where we're promoting our professionalism at a time when realtors are showing their communities and the world just who we are. NAR is pushing our organization to raise our bar and image. Higher standards and professional standards are a part of it. Where and how do we draw the line and monitor ourselves and our members, or status quo simply okay? To what level of speak is acceptable? Can and should NAR actually weigh in? Are we right? Are we walking on the rights of all American citizens being challenged? First Amendment rights to free speech being challenged by these proposed changes? That's an important question, especially for us as realtors. Change is difficult. Realtors know that. When change is a must, it's still difficult. Have any of your associations made changes that in
You're muted, Lester.
Lester, you're muted.
We got you. There we go.
Have I been muted the entire time?
No, just
No.
Lost you at associations.
Only for about 10 seconds.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. I was going to say, okay. Can and should, again, NAR weigh in? Change is difficult, even when change is a must. Again, I asked the question, have your associations made change and members didn't like it and the backlash came swiftly on social media or with phone calls? Today, we've asked a panel to discuss how and why they arrived to their conclusions and recommendations, and others to discuss instances that they've dealt with during their careers. We don't expect to give you all the answers, but a level of understanding of the type of actions that have brought us to this place in time. This has been a lightning rod topic on the NAR Hub. Questions include, is NAR out of its lane of simply selling real estate? Let's just do that. Let's everything else go. Do we really, and the question came, do we really say these type things now in 2020? Unfortunately, the answer is still yes sometimes. And doesn't matter if it's in 2020 or 50 years ago, it's still what's wrong then is still wrong. This may be one of the most pressing decisions made by the NAR Board of Directors on how we move forward. What will it say about who we are and who we will become? Today's panel includes the 2020 president of the Louisville chapter of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, NAREB, licensed in 2001. She's the managing broker of Buckner Real Estate Services, and newly elected member to the KYR MSI Board of Directors, Yalonda Buckner. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The conversation is Steve Casper, no stranger to Kentucky. Steve is licensed in both Kentucky and Ohio. Also a member of the Northern Kentucky Association of Realtors, co-founder of, if you've taken your SRS, Seller Representative Specialist, and sits on the advisory board relating to professional standards. He is a partner with Kopf, Hunter, and Haas Realtors, recognized as the Ohio Association of Realtors Distinguished Service Award recipient, a past Ohio and Michigan NAR RVP, and a past Cincinnati and Ohio Realtor of the Year. Thank you for joining us, Steve. Our next distinguished panelist is Cindy Wu Friedman. Cindy has a Bachelor in Management and Development and a Management Development degree for entrepreneurs from the University of Los Angeles, UCLA, California. Ms. Wu has been an educator in the real estate industry for over 20 years. She is the Director of Business Development and Training / Global Luxury Investment at RE/MAX office in the Los Angeles area. A strong passion for the industry. She is a past president for Women's Council of Realtors, Chinese American Real Estate. Some of the current and past involvement also include NAR's Public Policy Committee, Global Business Alliance Committee, YPM involvement in the past as well, and presently Secretary for the Asian Real Estate Association of America. Thank you for being here, Cindy.
Thank you very much, President Lester.
Thank you. Next, we have Bruce Aydt, a realtor and educator. Bruce is a licensed attorney in Missouri, a licensed real estate broker in Missouri with Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Alliance Real Estate, a NAR Distinguished Service Award winner. He is a member and past chair of the National Association of Realtors Professional Standards Committee. Just to name a few, Bruce holds his ABR, CRB, and SRS certification. A national trainer who's been recognized as the National Association of Realtors Trainer of the Year. Thank you, Bruce, for being with us again here in Kentucky.
You bet. Thank you, Lester.
Thank you. And then we have Matt Difanis. Is the 2020 National Association Realtor Professional Standards Chair. He's a past president of the Illinois Realtors. Matt is the team lead and broker owner with RE/MAX Realty in Champaign, Illinois. He's posted videos regarding race and conversations in real estate, and possibly has been the busiest person on the NAR hub over the past couple of weeks. Matt never shies away from what he believes in and prefers diving in to the deep end on issues. First, the deep end first again. When called to be involved in this town hall, he immediately said yes. And so I want to say thank you, Matt. Also joining us on this call, our CEO, Steve Stevens, and our president-elects from across the region. We have our own president-elect, Charles Hinckley, and also out of North Carolina, Kelly Marks. And again, it's time to turn it over to our moderator and NAR director, Lamont Breland.
Thank you, Lester, and thank you, KYR Realtors, for joining us for our 17th town hall. And we appreciate you all being here. And Lester, thank you for your leadership through this year. So Matt, let's start off with you. Thanks for being here. I know you're when you applied to be on the Professional Standards Committee a year or 2 or 3 ago, you probably didn't foresee this coming. I've been on the board of NAR, I guess, for maybe 4 or 5 years total throughout the years, and I don't recall. I'm sure there probably has been, but I don't recall a topic such as this getting quite so interesting. And I'm not going to say controversial because debate is healthy. The NAR portal, the hub, which all directors use as a communication tool, I think it had almost 500 comments as of an hour ago. And these aren't just LOLs and gotchas. I mean, these are long thought out responses, both for and against this. So Matt, it looks like there are maybe 3 changes, and I'm just going to recap here and correct me if I'm wrong. Policy Statement 29, which will basically apply to all realtor activity and not just real estate related activity. And then a new standard of practice 10.5, which maybe you can expand on how maybe that is different from 10.3. And then revisions to the definition of public trust, which looks like it surrounds willful versus all with regard to discrimination and fraud. So having said that, Matt, enlighten us.
So that we have more recommendations than that. Not all of them have to go to the board. Some of our deeper in the weeds recommendations, and let me just say at the top, I defer to Bruce, who has more expertise on this, both by virtue of experience, but also just encyclopedic knowledge and being an attorney. And this is his wheelhouse. So Bruce is always welcome, as is Steve Casper, to correct me where I am mistaken. But those are probably the three most significant ones to the broader audience. A couple of them are farther into the weeds, but the three biggies are opening up the applicability of the code to all a realtor's activities, not just real estate related or within the confines of a transaction. Let me start with that. That has a lot of people's hair on fire. And it has people's hair on fire because they immediately jump to the most extreme outcome that comes to mind, which is OMG, this empowers NAR and these pro standards weirdos to be the thought police. And it's really interesting because just in the last few minutes, I saw my second dissent on the hub coming from somebody who is an immigrant who lived under a communist regime. And so, Big Brother, it smacks of, what the committee, would have made them do. Committee having a whole different connotation in their communist background. So that's the first thing. Now, understand, we have to open up the scope if we're going to address hate speech. Remember, the issue that we're trying to battle are these bigoted keyboard warriors on social media spewing, in many cases, more vile hate speech than most of you would readily imagine. That's why one of my videos that I posted a week ago on YouTube reads several instances of hate speech uncensored. It's more vile than you would normally think of if you were imagining the worst thing you could think of on Facebook in 2020. We can't reach such bigoted conduct if the code is limited, as it currently is, only to real estate related activities and the confines of the real estate transaction. This does not mean that we suddenly in pro standards are deputized to go chasing into every facet of people's personal lives. Remember, by their very nature, most articles of the code are intrinsically related only to real estate related activities. But our premise was, after a lot of deliberation, a couple of key points on that. You can't take off the realtor branding because you feel like it, because you've left the office and now you're going home to be a private bigot, right? I mean, that's the issue. That's one of the issues. The other issue is this type of private, it's not related to work. I still live up to my letter and spirit of my Article 10 obligations at work, but at night I'm a flaming bigot. Yeah, well, no. And the reality is, even the instances of hate speech that weren't directly related to the day job, guess what the first thing is that ends up in every headline that trumpets these things? A realtor from so-and-so went on racist rant, shook an assault rifle into the camera saying, I want to shoot me some N-words. Or just this week in Arizona, the rant completely outside of a real estate office or a real estate transaction, 2 young Black males run into a person that was, of course, immediately identified as a realtor in all the news accounts, which have spread worldwide. News outlets in the UK, in Australia, worldwide. Arizona realtor declares to Black males that they are in a no N-word zone. Okay, so policy 29 has to open up as a threshold. It doesn't mean that suddenly Bruce and I and Steve are sniffing around in every facet of your personal life. And secondly, 10-5 is a targeted new proposed standard of practice that directly flows from our existing Article 10 obligations. It is, so on the one hand, we're opening up the code more broadly, but on the other hand, we're being very targeted with 10-5. Discriminatory hate speech. It has to be hate speech intended to harass, and it has to be targeted on the basis of one or more protected classes. It's not a question of, would somebody be offended? Am I espousing a religious conviction that might offend someone else? That's not where we're drawing that line. And then related to that is, oh, but this is so subjective. Right. Welcome to the code of ethics. Welcome to the law. Welcome to the trial by jury. I mean, subjectivity doesn't mean that we don't play in that sandbox. We already play in the subjectivity sandbox. It's where we live in pro standards. So that's, I guess I'll say all of that at the outset. It's a targeted solution to a problem that, if you look like me, is much, much, much worse than you would have any reason to believe that it is. But I'm telling you, there's so much in the way of this type of thing that's happening outside your field of view. So for many people that look like me, you're going to have not even seen the tip of the iceberg, but it's awful.
Gotcha. Thanks, Matt. Bruce, before you give us your thoughts, all of our members are familiar with professional standards here in Kentucky, but they may not be familiar with the NAR Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board, which you and Steve serve on. Can you give us a little background on that board and what you all do, and then let us know your thoughts on this?
Sure, Lamont, thanks very much. So the Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board is a subset of the full Professional Standards Committee. So Matt is chair of the full Professional Standards Committee. That's approximately 100 people from all over the country. There are representatives from every state that are on the Professional Standards Committee. And the Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board is a subset of about between 15 and 20 usually of those Professional Standards Committee members. And the way it's set up is that Matt, by virtue of the fact that he is chair of what we call the big committee this year, the full Professional Standards Committee, he will automatically be chair of the Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board next year. We will typically meet, and so I'm going to give you just this quickly because it gives you some information about how much thought and how much discussion has been put into these proposals. Typically, we would meet twice a year in March and September for roughly a day and a half meeting. Obviously, COVID has changed that, so we've had virtual meetings. But after our special Professional Standards Committee meeting that was called in the end of June, the Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board took this up, and we've met at least 5 or 6 times during the summer to get through these recommendations and to develop these recommendations, which then went back to the full Professional Standards Committee. The Interpretations Procedures Advisory Board has no authority to do anything except recommend to the full committee. So we recommend to the full committee these recommendations, then they are massaged by the full committee and ultimately were adopted by the full committee. And that's what we're discussing now. And it'll be on its way to the executive committee and board of directors during our meetings. So hope that wasn't too much, Lamont.
Perfect. No, absolutely. Steve, anything else to add on that now that you've explained the committee role? Any thoughts on what Matt had to say or anything before we move on?
Well, and thank you. In terms of the process, we did meet, I believe, 5 times. Had we voted at the 4th meeting, the status quo probably would have prevailed. However, there were a few on the committee that wanted to reach out further, and we specifically asked General Counsel, Katie Johnson, how far can we take it? And her response, in fact, is 29. It's her language, her writing. And the key answer she gave us is that it is completely defensible so that we're not overreaching the bounds of private industry. The other point that we recognized is the societal change. What once used to be funny, Foster Brooks acting like a drunk on every late night show, today, probably not so funny anymore. And then you take it to jokes about someone's ethnicity or background, whatever. What used to be funny is no longer funny. And the day before we took our vote in the 5th meeting, we had an example in private industry in our own backyard. The middle of the 5th inning of the Cincinnati Reds game against Kansas City. Tom Brenneman, son of Marty Brenneman, who is Hall of Famer, and some believed that the son was better than the father, got caught on a hot mic saying that Kansas City was the fag capital of the world. That was the middle of the 5th inning. They go live, the bottom of the 5th. Tom is already gone. He had been removed from the telecast. He didn't even get to finish the game. That's how private industry viewed it. If it was our scenario, he'd have grievance, he'd have a hearing, he'd have a right of appeal. That didn't even happen. That's how some of our thinking was shaped. And there are other examples I could give, but I'll let others speak.
Lamont, if I could just 1 second, I'd like to just comment a couple of things about Matt's development of these recommendations, just briefly.
Sure.
But one of the things I want to really kind of emphasize is that the proposal to expand policy statement 29, Matt mentioned it, but I want to emphasize it, is that alone does not mean that the code of ethics all of a sudden applies to everything in your personal life, my personal life, or any realtor's personal life. Matt described it as a threshold. That is correct. There can never be a violation of policy statement 29. So some people are confused that somehow we can have this policy statement and then I do something that somebody is offended by in the outside world, and all of a sudden I can be called to a code of ethics hearing. Well, no, the terms of the code of ethics all still apply. And as Matt said, virtually every article and standard of practice, and I think the only exception that I've come up with in looking at them all is Article 15, which talks about false or misleading statements about other real estate professionals. They all relate to and specifically have a connection to real estate activities and transactions. So please understand that this standard of practice 10-5 is the specific concept or the specific provision, as Matt said, that follows the opening up of policy statement 29. It's not the other way around. Policy statement 29 gives no authority to anybody to take any discipline against anybody. So thank you, Lamont.
Sure. So we've all seen a lot of these videos that are going around that you all have kind of pushed out to us and made available. One is the Newsday expose, I think it was Newsday. And that's real, you know, and we can all see ourselves at that table with folks and maybe not even knowing that there is some implicit bias that we all perhaps carry based on our the way we are brought up and our background and our culture and so forth. So I'm just curious, Cindy, you're out in California. Not that that means a whole lot, but you see it maybe a lot more than we see here in Kentucky. What's your background or experience with some type of implicit or unconscious bias?
Yeah, so you know, as an outspoken, hey everyone. So as an outspoken Asian woman, I definitely don't fit into the mold that some people may think of an Asian woman or API woman. So for me, you know, even hearing the term, and I don't know how many of you out there that has heard the term unconscious bias or implicit bias, right? I think as human beings, we all have that. It doesn't matter what color you are, whether you're yellow, blue, green, that we are just with a set of unconscious bias or implicit bias. And so with that, I think here, you know, I had the opportunity of spending, you know, I was born in Taiwan and coming here to America and just, you know, being embraced into a new culture. And that was a little bit of a culture shock and just understanding all that. But I had the fortune of going to Tennessee for a semester in high school. And that was a real shocker, as I call it. You know, coming from a community that was very diverse, you know, my high school was a fair amount of Caucasians, African-Americans, and Asians. It was a very mixed pot. However, when I first got to California, the school I went to was mostly, it was very few minority. I think I was one of two Asian that's on there. That's in the school. And so when I actually got to Tennessee, I had learned that, you know, and also moving forward with my professional career, that sometimes, you know, I am being judged just by being an Asian female, that a certain expectation is you know, is set. I was recently in a board meeting and somebody made the comment that, oh, Cindy, I know you like math. So I know, you know, Andrew, you know, President Kennedy, you know, his whole thing was about math. But, you know, unfortunately, I'm not one of those math geniuses, you know, even though I think a lot of people perceive Asians liking math. So for me, you know, my strength is really business development and sales. So I do think, you know, and I just want to kind of mention what unconscious bias is. So the bias is basically a prejudice in favor or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usual in a way that's considered to be unfair. And so it's basically having a lens, right? We all grew up differently. We all were brought up by different family members, maybe religion. And so whatever, for those of you that may have gone to Landmark, which I have, which is a you know, self-improvement course, that you, whatever you see, you have a lens. So whether your lens is yellow or green or whatever color it may be, but it's important for all of us, especially in the social climate around the country and what NAR is dealing with, is just to be aware that we have those biases. And so there is, you know, what I want to say about, so there's conscious bias and there's unconscious bias. So the conscious bias is things that we know. So we know we're not a surgeon, but the unconscious bias are things that you may not even be aware that it's changing the way you think, and it's changing the way how you behave within a environment. So with the whole NAR movement in regards to professional standards that's going to go in front of NAR, I think that's incredible, you know, work from the committee that's pushing forward, because I think it's very difficult for anyone who may have who may be in that space where they may have a certain discrimination or races, and actually expect them not to act differently in a real estate transaction. So for me, you know, I had to overcome quite a bit of I guess unconscious bias as a API woman in both organized real estate. But I think in the format of real estate transactions, you know, my client kind of all types. I recently sold a home to a African-American household who's a mixed race couple. And I know I hear from them that they hear sometimes they experience comments because it was a Latina and a African-American male. So they have their own share. But I think by us, especially we are in every community, we have influence over basically every aspect. And I agree with what Matt said, is that when there's news outbreak, they always, you know, you never hear people say, hey, the carpenter or a carpenter just did this, but it's always the realtor, because I think by us, our profession has such a profound effect and influence on the community. And that's why I think the media really point out that we're the realtors, because we're supposed to represent the community. So for me, I think it's just being aware of that we all have unconscious bias. Even I do, right? So just by the way how someone looks or anything else, we all have our unconscious bias, but just be aware of it. And having conversation like this will help you to be more sensitive of things to say and things not to say. There's a great book, and this would be, you know, the last thing I mentioned before we go to another panelist, is there's a great book called Shake Hands. You know, kiss, bow, and shake hands. So basically that's a book teaching you the different culture differences among cultures. And I think by just reading it would just help you be more aware, and also help you serve better as a realtor, dealing with various background of people. You know, so I think that's always important in our conversation.
Yeah, that's great. We'll put a link to that over in the chat to that book, so we can take a look at that. Yalonda Buckner, you are the current president of NAREB here in Louisville, and tell us a little bit about NAREB. Maybe some folks don't know about it, but it's been around a long, long time, and you serve us well as president. So what's going on with you, Yalonda?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And I definitely would like to start with just sharing just a little bit of history about the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. As many of you may know, I belong to NAR as a Realtor, and NAREB is also a trade organization. So we are the oldest Black minority trade organization in the country, and it was organized in 1947. You can go to NAREB, and that's NAREB.com, and you can see a video. But we were organized because we were not allowed as Black real estate agents to belong to NAR. We were excluded from all the MSI boards. We could not sell in certain areas. And as you know, there were deed restrictions of Blacks could not purchase homes in neighborhoods. And so about 7 people got together in Florida in 1946 and organized its own trade organization, which has a high standard of code of ethics. Many of the things that you see in NAR is also there. And so people say, well, now that you are allowed to join NAR and you are allowed to join GLAR, so it's not necessary. So, and that is far from truth. It would be nice if we didn't need NAREB. And what it is, it's because like laws are made, laws are broken, laws are not always followed. And so we have to continue. So what I want to call your attention to is that we put out a report, and that report is called the Sheba Report. So I would like for everyone to read the Sheba Report. It gives the state of housing in Black America, because the statistics don't lie. So in 1968, the Fair Housing Act, the Black home ownership was somewhere around 49%. Okay, so today we're at a national of 47%. And so why is that? It's the question that needs to be asked, that we're no further along than we were when it was legal to discriminate. And in Louisville, there was a study done that it's even worse in Louisville because we're somewhere around 36%. And predominantly Blacks live in West Louisville. So then we ask ourselves, well, how did we even get there? And as you all may know in the history, if you read about the redlining, it's not only the redlining to where, okay, we're not gonna make loans in these areas, but when the government systematically created a policy that says, okay, we're gonna build all of these homes, but we are not going to allow these loans to go to Blacks. So generations, while white families were building wealth, and we know, we're preaching to the choir here, we know that home ownership is the #1 way to increase, to build wealth, right? And to pass it down, generational wealth. So if you had those home loans being denied, okay, and we were not allowed, so that's why you look around in your community and you say, why are we so segregated? And that is the very reason why. So it has to be policies that are made to bring some reparation and do some repairing in that. So we still, NAREB is lobbying nationally to deal with some of the barriers that exist. The numbers of mortgages, we're more likely to have FHA loans. We're more likely to have the higher student loan debt. And let me give you an example of what is the real difference, okay, with credit. If you are a Black person, what they found was a Black person could go into a bank and be denied, and then they send the same person, a white person, in, and that person was denied, but here was the difference. Then that person was told what they needed to do to get that loan. And then that person, the white person, comes back in and gets the loan. So the extra information is not given. So there is a gentleman that I would like for you all to watch a video. It's called Phil Beischer. And he has on YouTube videos where he explains a lot of this. But let me break it down a little bit more specific to the Louisville area and this social media that we're talking about. So we had an incident, right, a few years ago where an agent made a comment, and it had to do with, oh, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, basically my child's not getting in because they letting all the minorities in. So to get into this, you know, Ivy League school. And so the people in the Black community, you know, posted things, and they said, the very picture that she's showing shows predominantly whites in there, and there's only 1 or 2 Blacks. So what was she talking about? And if she were to look at the number of Black students in this particular Ivy League college, it's so minute. And so, but just like we're saying, when you do say something hateful or offensive, what they do on social media is immediately look you up. And that's what happened here in Louisville. So other people look this person up, oh, they're a realtor. And immediately, what did they say? We are not going to support this real estate company. And it just went, you know, viral. So I think it's very important, the conversation that we're having, that we, as realtors and realtors, that we do have to watch what we say, the hate speech, because these things are very real for people. Okay, it's very real. It's very different for a Black real estate agent than it is for a white real estate agent. Okay, so, and something that you may not think about, but Black agents, we experience double racism, because not only are we, I have been told since I've been in the business, hey, make sure you sell that house to a white person. Okay, make sure you take the pictures down, get a white person to sell your home. And then you'll have Black people that will even feel like, oh, well, the white person is superior, I'm gonna get a white agent. So we get that, we get it both ways. So, and recently on social media, a realtor here in this city, we got into a private discussion on the phone. So when you talk about bias, and if I were to even tell you the things that he said to me, I think you would be appalled. You would be appalled. Words like welfare queens and just all this other stuff that he said was very offensive. And he's been on Facebook and he said things that have been very offensive. So I feel like that this is important. Now, do I think that people should, you know, I think there is a line, definitely. You know, I read some comments about, oh, we can't say blinds because then it'll be talking about somebody being blind or whatever. But I do think this is important. And I do think it should go, that when you become an agent, that you should know you can't say everything, that you do follow this code of ethics and of hate. And so, because this is very real, it's still real for us today. Very real. The numbers, 7% home ownership among Blacks, 36%, you know, that's still not good. And the racism. I had one agent to say to me over the phone, everything was good. But when the buyer saw her in person, oh, by the way, you know, my friend sells real estate or whatever. So do you think there are people that don't want us to sell them houses because we're Black? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. That is still today. That is still today. That's not going away. And I have to call out my own industry because, you know, I got into real estate in 2001, right? So when people relocate here, we're still redlining. We redline more than anybody. You know why? Because we say, go to area 789. You all have been told that. 789. So I'm like, okay, why do you go to 7, 8, 9? You know, because then people talk about the crime or they talk about this. And, you know, and I go all over Jefferson County, Shelby, Oldham, or whatever. So I know the area, and I have a variety of clients, Black, white, rich, poor, all, you know, all over the place. So I probably have a pretty good perspective. So, you know, we need to stop doing that. We need to stop saying 7, 8, and 9. We need to force, we should have more businesses and viable shopping in South Louisville and other places. And even the West Louisville gets the worst rap. It's not that things are not going on there, okay? There's a lot of things that's not even reported in Jefferson County. So, you know, that's a whole nother story of things that don't get reported. I live in the suburbs, so I know, okay? So someone committed suicide, hung themselves on Mother's Day. That should have been a big story. It was on my street, never reported, okay? So there's, you know, you're starting to see more white families even moving in West Louisville because of the price of home, but we have to stop doing that ourselves so that, you know, we can reverse this segregation that we have, you know? And, but anyway, so that's kind of my take. I do believe we need this conversation. I do think that, for example, when the, what was it? The home inspector, you know, and we stay quiet about things. So everybody in our Facebook groups was talking about this home inspector. So then they started saying, well, we're not going to allow this home inspector to show our home. And no one ever said his name, right? Until he comes on one of my listings and has a conversation with my client that was very negative about real estate agents. And he went as far as to say, you shouldn't buy this house. This house is okay to rent, but not to buy, just all of this stuff. I was furious. So, and just a long story short, 3 years later, had he listened to him, you know, the young man walked away with $40,000, an African-American. I just sold it. So he, listening to him was crazy. But anyway, so then he goes, so then I go on the Facebook post and I say to my colleagues, hey, have you all ever had a home inspector to tell your buyer not to buy a house and don't listen to realtors? And I said, and someone said, well, Yalonda, who is this? And so I give the name, and then everybody starts saying, he strikes again. And I'm like, why didn't you all say this beforehand? You know, so we have to talk about it. This person talks about, let's shoot realtors, you know? So should, you know, people in the real estate industry should be held to ethics, you know, higher ethics and whatever. So I believe we should have this, but I don't think, and see, here's the thing with social media. We're saying my personal life and my business life. But what we're doing is in social media, we're using the business in with the personal. And we're not really separating that because the way Facebook's is set up, your business page doesn't get a lot of traffic, right? Mm-hmm. So we're posting homes and real estate on our personal page. We're not separating it. We're going on our Twitter and Instagram and we're bringing it into the personal. So where is the personal? Yeah. Because I'm not seeing the complete separation of that, right? And we're being taught, post to social media, post to Instagram, post to LinkedIn, post your business there. So where do we draw the line on what's your personal life? You're talking in a room privately, and I think as real estate agents, we have to understand of the different careers, we get a bad rap. Yeah. Right.
That brings up a good point. And let me ask our NAR folks that are committee members. That seems to be one of the biggest concerns that I see as I'm looking through on the hub is, you know, where is the, I mean, no one that I have ever seen or thinks that racism or any of the protected classes, you know, all of those things are super important and are the backbone of what we do as realtors. And that doesn't seem to be where the questions are. The questions are more the subtle things that are said where you don't know someone's heart. I think, and there's lots of scenarios that people have put out there, and the more comfortable you get with people, like Lester and I, we tease each other, that black and white stuff, and it is funny. But if someone else sometimes would hear that, they may not think it's so funny. My best friend in college, best man at my wedding, his name was Sean Patrick Perkins. He's black. I'm Clyde Lamont Breland. I'm white. See where I'm going with that? That was always the joke, our names. Everybody thought he was Lamont and I was Sean, and we joke about it to this day. And we probably do it on social media. Well, if that offends someone, what is the process for me to be either found guilty or exonerated?
Well, Lamont, let me first commend you on bringing up a scenario that Bruce and I have not heard 100 times, because there's a few that have repeated themselves over and over and over. And context matters. Remember, professional standards volunteers are specially trained. They live in the native habitat of subjective judgments. That's the way the code is already written. What is or is not a true picture? What is or is not a pertinent fact? Those are inherently subjective judgments. Panelists make those all the time. In the case of what you just mentioned, if somebody overheard something out of context and thought you were being racist or racially insensitive, and in fact, it was quite the opposite, you have such a close friendship with someone who doesn't look like you that you basically have a running inside joke. Context matters. It would either not make it past grievance on its face, or if it did, because remember, at the grievance stage, you're not tendering a response if you were the respondent. But if it did, you would have a very, very solid defense to stand on. And honestly, because I've seen this happen recently in other contexts, I think a complainant, there's a real good chance they'd simply drop the complaint, and it would get kicked back to grievance to make sure they didn't think it was a violation of the public trust, and then that's the end of it. But I don't see any chance that something like that, with you able to offer a response, is going to result in a finding of violation. This is much more targeted and specific than I think a lot of folks worry that it will be. And those who think it's too much or too big or an overreaction or too soon, I've heard all of those things. Well, depending on where you're measuring from, is it too soon because we're 46 years after fair housing was put in the code? Is it too soon because it's 52 years after fair housing became the law of the land? Is it too soon because we're 401 years after Black people first came here in chains after being kidnapped? Too soon based on which of those? The status quo remains appalling, absolutely appalling. And if you don't think that, I'm just telling you, it's because you haven't been exposed to enough of the bad behavior. The bad behavior is unacceptable, and it is currently absolutely outside the scope of what we can touch with the code. There is no better lane within our industry than pro standards. That was a threshold conversation. Should this be kicked over to be put in bylaws as a membership duty? But that's open to more inconsistency. It's less targeted. The volunteers hearing such things aren't as well trained. And honestly, next to the NAR Constitution, what defines who we are? The code. I don't expect any of you to live to wake up every morning and think, I'm a realtor. I live by paragraph 17A, subparagraph 1 of my bylaws. But you all know that you're bound to live by the code and that you voluntarily have promised to hold yourself to a higher standard. Every new member is given a copy and told, read it, live by it. I don't expect them all to have it memorized, but they know it exists and they know that defines who we are. The code is the right place for it. The problem is incredibly severe, more so than people that look like me would realize, and I wouldn't have realized it but for the fact that I've had some very improbable life experiences. So, yeah, that's.
So
I'll step
I'd
off
like
my
to-
soapbox for a minute. Take a breath.
So Lamont, let me follow up also with Matt's comments about context. So in your little scenario that you described, I agree with Matt. There's no way that could be considered, given the context, that that's any kind of harassing speech, hate speech, epithet, or slur because of the context of your relationship with this other person. Likewise, I want to kind of just clarify, when Matt talks about living in the world of subjectivity, he's talking about assessing, I think, all of the facts and circumstances of the case. I phrase it a little differently because what I say is that, in fact, the terms that we lay out, such as hate speech, harassing speech, epithets, and slurs based upon the protected classes, that those are objective standards. It isn't a standard where somebody just complains because they subjectively feel offended. You know, I mean, there are people who might have their feelings hurt about things that when you look at it, you go, of course, that's not hate speech or harassing speech or a slur or an epithet. So just, I think, consider that we've tried to lay out as many kinds of specifics, as Matt was saying, very targeted things that we're looking at, and we're not looking at differences in political opinions, differences in religious beliefs. So there's a couple of comments about Christians expressing their beliefs on social media. I'll turn that around and say, how would you feel about Muslims discussing their beliefs on social media? Those are your religious beliefs, and as long as they aren't attacking another group, then that's not hate speech. The two examples that I've used is that on the one hand, somebody might say something like, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. Okay. If you take that one step further, as a realtor in, I believe it was Georgia did.
Georgia.
Yeah. The statement was, lesbians and gays are murderers according to the scriptures. That's hate speech. The other is not.
Got it. So so a big part of this is standard of practice 10.5. So I just want to read it real quick, and then let me know maybe where there have been some issues or concerns. So the proposed standard of practice 10.5 says, realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So where's the controversy there? Or is there, I mean, there's.
So there, personally, what I see kind of happening is, unfortunately, what we've kind of collectively labeled this as is a standard of practice about offensive or discriminatory speech. And, you know, being a lawyer, you know, I probably say a lot more than I ought to say in terms of just, you know, clacking, but I like to be more specific. And so, yes, it is about a general idea of offensive speech, but it's not just what anybody thinks is offensive. It's targeted to harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, and slurs based on the protected classes. And then we have further information in an appendix that's being proposed that gives people, both members, panels, and grievance committees, guidance on what those terms that you can base those terms on. One of them is NAR's harassment policy. So what we've tried to do is be as targeted and as specific as possible. And this is not just about what an individual might feel is offensive.
Gotcha. All right, let's switch to the, yeah, go ahead.
Lamont, if I may just share, you know, I think one way of kind of addressing that, and I think sometimes people may have comments that they don't even know that it's discriminatory or hateful. So I just want to share the California Association of Realtors, which is one of the largest state association within NAR. We recently had the Board of Director meeting where we passed to have all new licensee and also all renewal realtors to take unconscious bias classes as a part of their renewal. And I think by just having more education, because sometimes I think people do it unintentionally, some people may do it intentionally. So, but I think by having more education will help facilitate some of that.
Is that a mandatory class?
Yeah, so it's not a law yet, but it's definitely a policy that's passed within KYR. And also KYR recently hired a new staffer. It's called the Director of Diversity and Inclusion. So not only that person is working with fair housing issues, but also to make sure that organized real estate, both on a state and local level, have inclusive of all races and all ethnicities as well. So, but at this point, it just passed in what are we now? September. So it just passed in September, October. Yeah, so it's something that we're moving forward to make sure that, you know, we can't just assume that everybody come from some background or some training as to different races and background.
Gotcha.
Let me seize on something that Cindy said, because I don't want it to terrify you. Hey, wait a minute. She just said you could do this unintentionally. That makes me even more terrified. I want to reiterate that we're talking about hate speech intended to harass or intimidate and based upon someone's membership in a protected class. It is a high bar. Implicit bias is by its very definition unintended. So I want to separate those issues. We all need implicit bias training because our brains are all wired to take shortcuts. And because they're implicit, by definition, it happens without our conscious awareness. That doesn't, so that's the problem right now. You hear, I'm a white guy, you hear implicit bias, you hear institutional racism, you hear organizational racism, and the white person hears, you're a racist. And that doesn't prompt a natural response of, really? Tell me more about my deep-seated bigotry. That's exactly not how white people respond to that. They dig their heels in, they get defensive. And that doesn't mean implicit bias isn't a thing. It means it's implicit. It means you literally don't have a consciously racist thought in your head. But it doesn't mean you're not going to have a disparate impact on the clients that walk through your door, as evidenced by the Newsday expose. Those realtors didn't wake up seeking to discriminate. They didn't even know they were discriminating while they were in the middle of discriminating. The video evidence doesn't lie. They did. The treatment was wildly different, but it was unintentional. So everyone should be on a journey of self-improvement to sensitize themselves to the circumstances where NAR's program is called bias override. The implicit bias training is called bias override because it teaches you how to recognize the situations, how to take your brain off autopilot and go to manually flying the aircraft so you can navigate those situations correctly. But I want to underscore, with respect to our proposals today, the bar is high. It is very targeted. Hate speech intended to harass or insult based on one's membership in a protected class.
Gotcha. And let me remind everybody, as we've got probably another 5 minutes or so, if you have any questions at all, please put them over in the chat bar there, and we're all monitoring those and trying to answer them because this is your chance. Let me ask you, so with regard to revision of the definitions of public trust, what's the difference between willful versus all? That seems to be a bone of contention.
So I'll kick that one off just briefly, and that is that under Article 10 of the code, there is no requirement that it be willful discrimination. So the existing standard that we've had for the past 40-something years is any type of discrimination can be a violation of the code. This concept of willful discrimination and public trust relates to when an association has a responsibility to report to the regulatory authorities that there is evidence of some type of discrimination. And this went into effect in the year 2000, approximately 2000. And at that time, the belief was that, gee whiz, will only have intentional discrimination reported to the regulatory authorities. I believe the belief of the Professional Standards Committee is that if this is discrimination based upon the protected classes, it ought to be consistent with what's in Article 10. And Article 10 says discrimination on the basis of the protected classes is a violation of the code. And while the reporting to the state regulatory authority would not be of the ethical violation, it would simply be, here's some information that we have. You all decide whether or not that violates the license law.
Gotcha.
And I'm going to jump in with a response to Charles in the chat box. So don't say that, don't think that taking out willful suddenly means we're doing something that's worse. I mean, so his comment was, yeah, but implicit bias training is believed by many scholars not to work. Well, so then does that mean when you look at the Newsday expose where the fallout is still happening, the ethics hearings are still happening, the HUD investigation is still happening, just because it wasn't willful, but where the outcome was clearly disparate, a totally different experience for the Black testers compared to the white testers. And they didn't even know it. You know, if you watch those resources, it's the debrief where you have a Black tester and a white tester debriefing on video together. And you can watch the Black tester's face change when they realized, oh my gosh, I was being treated respectfully and politely. And only now am I realizing, and yet I was still being given a completely different experience.
Man, I agree with that.
Willful's not the bar here. We have to, and we already can be subject to all sorts of penalties for inadvertent, disparate impact discrimination.
I now understand that. And it was a 3-hour video, and I have to admit I skimmed parts of it, watched most of it, but didn't have 3 hours to sit and watch. The point I was trying to make, and I've made it in our conversations before, and I've tried not to keep my conversations privately between us as much as I could. The concerns that I have is some of the challenges with terminology. In particular, I'm looking at 6 different definitions of hate speech that vary in degree, although they do talk about the same class. That's a concern for me. I've had people send me text messages and phone calls asking about religious freedom, pitting these 2 groups against each other that are protected, which I've sent Bruce, and I've also sent you some things. I didn't go into too much detail on a lot of those different issues, but those are some concerns that I see going forward about who gets to define whatever. My point about implicit bias training was they have yet to show any statistical change from those who have gone through implicit bias training that it's made any significant or statistical change in people's behavior. And I've argued from the very beginning, I've never changed 1 minute. I am absolutely against any type of discrimination of that nature. My first wife was Native American. My wife is Japanese. My son is mixed. My brother-in-law is Black. My family's Black. I will stand and fight and have been for a long time against those type of aspects. But I'm concerned whenever we start trying to possibly pit one against the other. I'm fine with the subjectivity of it, but I'm concerned when we don't have definitive definitions going into it.
Thanks,
But
Charles.
the lack of definitive definitions is what lends to the subjectivity. I mean, unfortunately, they're just inextricably linked, and that's just the world of pro standards.
And again, I say things like this. If a Muslim writes out and says, I'm an infidel because I'm not a Muslim, personally, I don't care. If somebody says that I'm whatever I am because of whatever I happen to be, that's an opinion they happen to have. Not everybody's going to like it. Not everybody's going to hate you. But I'm concerned when some of the subjectivity could pit one class against another inside the protected classes. And so I appreciate the attempt. I like 29. I said that in my emails to you guys. I like 29. I think it's important because when somebody is blatantly discriminatory, like the ones you've mentioned and some others that I've seen, I will lock arms with you and do what you've done. And I think Bruce, in our conversations, where you fire a realtor, I don't want you to be a part of me. And I think that's a great thing to do there.
Very good. Any other closing comments by anybody?
Are we saying that there would have to be damage done to an individual in order for some type of sanction or fine or?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Good question. Good question, Yalonda. Absolutely not.
Anybody else? Got one more question down here.
Yeah, so maybe I'll ask the question that let's just assume that this passes with NAR BODs. So moving forward, how should somebody, if they do realize that either they saw on social media or direct comment, how should they go about reporting that comment or hate crime or
screenshot and a code of ethics violation, the same as they would right now if they had a screenshot within the context of their negotiation where it appeared that somebody was behaving in a discriminatory fashion. So it's going to be the same thing. We, on pro standards, we have a stack, and they still come in, multiple times every week. We have a stack of stuff that is just clearly discriminatory hate speech. All of you would quickly agree discriminatory hate speech. I use several of the most egregious examples. But yeah, it's going to be a matter of, look, here's the evidence, and it goes to hearing. So the procedure is exactly what we already have. And again, part of why it's well suited for our lane. We have the procedure. We have 273 pages in a bound volume of a part of our due process, supplemented by an additional body of information that we revise so frequently that it is an online library only. And if we need to fine tune, if we need to clarify, we are on standby. It's not just because of this, we're on standby all the time. Pro standards is an ongoing process all the time. And honestly, the pandemic and our ability to convene via Zoom actually puts us in a better position to respond faster than we normally would have been able to do in years past.
So they would report to the local association, correct?
Any of the places. They could start with NAR, they could start with the state, they could start with the local, they could start with an ombudsman, they could start, it wouldn't be appropriate for ethics citation, but they could start there, and it's still going to end up going through the right channels, and they'll get the assistance they need if they're not familiar with the process. Because the whole point is, this is supposed to be a much, much, much user-friendlier process than filing a complaint in a court of law.
So while social media seems to get the lion's share of attention, this would also carry over, as Yalonda said, just in talking over the telephone to other agents, texts, around the water cooler, emails, all those types of things, right?
Yep, the burden of proof is going to be high, and so social media and emails obviously are the most frequent because number one, they get the most visibility thanks to reposting, resharing, and the screenshot. But also, obviously you've got the evidence that's at least a little closer to prima facie. Obviously context still matters, but if somebody uses a slur, a racial slur, it's right there in the post. But yeah, any of those things would be, but just understand your conversation at the bar, your conversation on a telephone conversation is going to require witnesses to come in and convince to a clear and convincing threshold, convince the majority of that hearing panel that this met all of the requirements to fall within Article 10 as amplified under proposed standard of practice 10-5.
Very good. We have one more question down here. Does anyone have concern about what might happen if a realtor refuses to work with someone due to information found through the forewarn system?
That's already a very hot topic, especially. So I'm from Champaign, not Chicago. That's a hot topic in the city of Chicago, and I'm on the same MLS. People need to be very careful. I just said in I'm a multi-office broker owner. I just admonish people, be very careful, use it as information, use it to decide if you want to maybe have somebody else with you or take some extra security measures, but do not use it to decide who you're working with or not working with, especially given how much of the information does not rise, speaking of due process and burdens of proof, an arrest record with no conviction. I mean, that's the classic example. I'm not working with that person because they were once arrested with a charge of X, and that sounds really bad, except that they were never convicted. And they may have even been strategically overcharged as a leverage tool by a prosecutor. I say that as the son of a 19-year prosecutor.
I'm glad she put that in the chat, because I think that's something that we're looking at in our board, and I have a lot of concern about that particular using that because someone could have a felony. When you do a background check on someone, it only shows the F that's a felony. So you do not receive the other information behind it to show that it was reduced to misdemeanor, whereas it sounds like they're a big drug lord, but then actually it wasn't even that significant and it was reduced to misdemeanor. So then we're looking at these records and they sound like horrible, but then we don't know the circumstances behind it and all of that. So I'm glad she put that in there, because I'm very concerned about how we will use this information. And then would we use it even if we're not just showing a house, or we just want to meddle about people or something? So I do think we need to, that could turn into discrimination very quickly if it is used wrongly, and it just may not be what it appears to be. So that, be concerned about everyone that's using that, be very concerned about it, because those records are not always what they appear to be. So we're judging people, and someone could actually be a serial killer or a sex offender, and they have a very clean record.
Right. Good. Well, listen, everyone, this has been our longest town hall, and that's a good thing. I'm sure, Matt, you've probably got 141 new messages that you got to get back to on the hub. So thank you all for being with us today. It's a great topic, very timely, and thank you for your service on those committees. And I'm going to turn it back over to Lester, Mr. President Sanders. Lester.
Thank you, Mr. Breland. I certainly appreciate Matt, Bruce, Yalonda, Cindy, Steve, willing to stand up in the front of the firing lines in some cases, but certainly to do what you think and to say what you think is right to help build NAR and our local associations into the best association that we can possibly be. These are uneasy conversations, but they continue to need to be had, and so we just have to continue these kind of conversations, and change does come. And as I opened up saying, change isn't always easy. So maybe this gets through, maybe it gets through at a different time. But you brought a level of understanding that didn't clearly exist on the hub. People were just going all over the place. And that's why it was important that you came today. And so we really appreciate you. For all the people, all the members that stayed on, I mean, I looked at the participants and we were at 90 and we were at 108 to begin with. And we're over, and other people have other meetings they had to attend to. So that says something about how important this conversation is. And I think you've armed us with more information than what we had, and you explained some of the challenges, although we know that some will remain. There's always going to be a reason to keep things the same as well. So I appreciate you. We're not bashful about picking up the phone and calling and saying, hey, will you come back? So thank you for what you're doing for the association.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you, Kentucky Realtors.